I'd like to share some findings from a recent IEP, the report, which kind of sort of try and provide additional insight into how well we're doing with regards to reducing violence and a lot of sort of the targets and indicators relative to SDG 16. So I'm just going to bring that up on screen now. The Institute for Economics and Peace, we're a non-profit, non-partisan research institute. We're dedicated to shifting the world's focus to peace as a positive, tangible, and achievable measure of human well-being and progress. The origins of the Institute stem essentially from the question, what are the most peaceful countries on Earth? And at the time, there was sort of a lot of debate about this, but there was very little quantitative research around this subject. So the Global Peace Index stems from the desire to answer that question, as well as to track trends in peace and to also calculate the economic cost of violence as a way of incentivizing peace-building activities. So thankfully, that work has been very well received, and it's consulted frequently by a variety of multilateral organizations and governments around the world, as well as in university courses, and it's shared very frequently online. This has given us the opportunity to be able to open up a variety of international offices that would be extremely happy to hear from any one of you. So this is the 14th year of the Global Peace Index, and it ranks 163 countries according to their relative state of peace. So the definition of peace in the index is the lack of violence or fear of violence. And we track that using 23 different indicators. And the methodology for doing that is developed by IEP, but it is sort of overseen by an international panel of experts. So the indicators are largely distributed in 3 domains. So the first one is related to domestic and international conflict. The second is related to measures of safety and security within society. And the third is the degree of militarization. Let's jump straight into some of the key findings for the 2020 report. This is sort of a mud map. Essentially, the countries in red are the least peaceful, the countries in green are the most peaceful. And you can actually access this in an interactive way in our website. You can click on any individual country, have a look at their indicators, and actually see the trends in indicators over the last 10 years. Overall, we see that the average level of peacefulness has deteriorated by 0.34%. That's the 9th deterioration in the last 12 years. 81 countries became more peaceful, 80 countries deteriorated, and improvements were driven by changes in terrorism, the impact of terrorism, homicides, weapons imports and exports, and deteriorations by the political terror scale, refugees and IDPs, and intensity of internal conflict. Now, today's talk is going to focus slightly on democracies versus authoritarian regimes. The political terror scale would be a sort of a generally accurate representation of this. So this refers to things like extrajudicial killings, imprisonment without trial, and torture. These are the 10 most peaceful countries for the 2020 report. All of these, with the exception of Singapore, are considered or esteemed to be full democracies. These are the 10 least peaceful countries. All of these, with the exception of South Sudan, that hasn't made it into the metric that we consult, are deemed to be authoritarian regimes. Now, in terms of trends of peace, I mentioned before that we've seen a decline in peace over the last 12 years. And this graph here may not initially be intuitive because we're measuring negatives. When we see charts go up like this, that means that there's been a deterioration. So please bear that in mind for the charts that you will see next. Overall, 81 countries became less peaceful. 79 countries became more peaceful, highlighting that decreases in peace are larger than increases in peacefulness. And overall peace over the last 10-12 years has declined by 2.5%. When we break this out into the 3 domains that I mentioned before, we see that levels of militarization have continued to improve by 4.5%, a small deterioration in safety and security, but there has been a significant increase in ongoing conflict that is largely in authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. Now, breaking this out a tiny bit more, we do see a general difference even in trends with regards to levels of peacefulness for democracies versus authoritarian regimes. But interestingly, we do see a significant decrease in peacefulness in democracies in full democracies over the last 5 years that correlates very closely with the civil unrest we've been seeing since the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis. So this is breaking down these indicators slightly more. We see that the deaths from terrorism are now at the lowest point that they have been in the last decade, but that comes from coming off a very large spike that coincides with the Iraq and Syria war. We often see a very close correlation between battle deaths and the impact of terrorism, because terrorism is essentially used as an instrument of war. We've seen that the number of refugees and IDPs has steadily increased in the world. On the flip side, on the good side, I suppose you could say, we have seen a sustained decrease in global homicide rates. In terms of ongoing conflicts, the battle deaths spike that you see here was the wars in Iraq and Syria primarily. As those have come to a close, we've seen that go down. But like I mentioned before, we have seen an increase in numbers of conflicts. So we've seen that the large sort of theaters of war, the Syrias, the Iraqs, the Afghanistans have drawn to a close or become smaller. But we've seen a sprouting up of smaller regional conflicts around the world. Very briefly, in terms of militarization, a general decrease in armed forces personnel, general sustained decrease in military expenditure, although we have seen a steady increase in the number of weapons imports. So the economic impact of violence in 2020 we calculate to be $14.5 trillion. That's kind of sort of a difficult number to fathom, but it basically equates to 10% of the world's GDP, or nearly $2,000 per person. So I know that we can't sort of imagine a world that's completely peaceful, but hey, what if we could make it 10% more peaceful? Well, that would mean that there's $1.5 trillion that could be used to other economic activities, ideally, or a variety of activities, ideally activities that are going to contribute further to development of peacefulness. So this brings me to positive peace, which refers to the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. So this is a term that's used commonly in the peace building field, but we've tried to develop a quantitative measure for. And essentially what we've tried to do is take results from the Global Peace Index and compare that with thousands of measures of socioeconomic progress to see which are the ones that correlate most closely with subsequent ups and downs in a country's level of peace, right? To be able to see essentially what makes peace tick. There are 300 indicators that correlate very closely, and those, generally speaking, fall into 8 buckets, which we call the 8 pillars of positive peace. They are these ones. These are the characteristics of the most peaceful societies on Earth. And these pillars interact and relate to each other systemically in incredibly complex ways. One of the things that we see is that countries with high levels of positive peace also have higher per capita income, high levels of resilience to crises such as COVID-19, political shocks, ecological threats, better environmental outcomes, higher measures of well-being, and better performance on development goals. Now, there's also a very strong correlation with the SDGs. We see that 85% of the SDGs 169 targets are relevant to at least sort of 2 pillars of positive peace. The only area that we don't see that largely is for free flow of information and low levels of corruption, which are actually most described in SDG 16. So something to note there. Now, when we break out the positive peace indicators per domain, we see something pretty interesting. This is the overall positive peace score globally, which has improved 2.5% over the last decade. So if we then look at institutions, this is generally operations of government. We see that there has been more, that it is very slowly, progressively improved, right? If we see things like structures, which are things that are embedded in society, so specifically things like poverty, GDP, for example, and measures of GDP, we see a significant improvement, largely a reflection of higher levels of equality in society. But what we have seen over the last decade is a significant decrease in the attitudes domain, so which runs very counterintuitively to the improvements in structures. What does this look like in an individual country? I've pulled out the United States because this is where a lot of us are today, but this could apply to many other countries around the world. So on the left-hand side, you see the positive peace indicators, and you see that the largest deteriorations have been quality of information that people have access to, A term commonly used here, for example, is fake news. Factionalized elites, which is the reality or the impression that the government does not represent the people or is controlled by a very small group of people. And group grievances, as well as restrictions on freedom of the press as well. These are all also generally considered characteristics of authoritarian regimes. So this is contributing to, running parallel to, correlates with some of the global trends in civil unrest we've been seeing. There's been a sharp rise in the level of civil unrest over the last decade. The number of riots, general strikes, and anti-government protests has more than doubled. Europe has had the largest number of protests, riots, and strikes, although the majority of those have been peaceful, and civil unrest in sub-Saharan Africa has risen more than 800%. This is a breakout, sort of based on types of governance, in which we do see a general increase in civil unrest in all of these, but especially in what is deemed to be here flawed democracies. So, the general impression that there is a measure of inequality and people protesting those measures. So I'd just like to finish today. I couldn't not talk about COVID-19 and peace, of course. We've got a dedicated paper on this that came out about a month and a half ago. We expect most of the indicators on the Global Peace Index to deteriorate. Military expenditure may improve because countries will need all of that money essentially to be able to prop up their own economies. We see a change in the types of sort of crimes that are being committed, but we do generally expect that to return to how it was once the COVID pandemic has subsided. We do expect the US and Europe to see an increase in political instability in general. US-China relations are deteriorating, and that could have wider global implications. Support for UN peacekeeping operations and development aid is expected to significantly decrease. That could have significant repercussions on countries that are currently receiving aid, and even countries that are developed are likely to be impacted. Now, I'd like to leave you very quickly with this thought regarding the SDGs and the progress of the SDGs. On the right-hand side, you have an SDG 16 progress report that IEP generated that came out in March 2019. And I'd just like to raise the issue of where we are in terms of data collection for a lot of the things related to SDG 16. In this report, we noted that of the 56 indicators included in SDG 16 plus, less than half have officially recognized data sources. In 2018, 5 of the 12 SDG targets were not being measured by any country. Just 4 of the 44 indicators in SDG 16 have data for the 163 countries that we tracked. Now, this is a very apt time to sort of reconsider how we are doing, because obviously we're reaching the 5-year mark of the SDGs in general. So, I think it's a very valid exercise. We're actually seeking foundation partners to make this possible, as well as for the development of a US Peace Index that I think would be extremely relevant to the time as well. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.